It was Monday, the 3rd of March, 2021. I remember the date because I had circled it on my calendar weeks before. A red mark, something I thought would symbolize a fresh start, a move into a new apartment, a new address. Number 37 on Via Garibaldi in Cannaregio, Venice. The city had always fascinated me. The canals, the bridges, the quiet hum of life that seemed to move differently here. I told myself it was the perfect escape, far enough from the chaos of my old routine in Milan, close enough to history, to art, to something that felt more alive than I had been in years. I arrived late in the afternoon. The air was damp, heavy with that familiar brackish smell of water that clings to every stone in Venice. I dragged my suitcases up the narrow stairwell, my arms aching, the wood of the steps creaking under every step. The building was old, 17th century maybe, with chipped plaster on the walls and iron railings that had been painted too many times. It wasn't luxurious, it wasn't modern, but it was mine. I spent the first hours unpacking, fumbling with cardboard boxes, cursing at screws that refused to fit into cheap furniture. The walls were bare, echoing back the sound of my own footsteps. And yet, despite the exhaustion, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Relief. But then came the night. My first night on Via Garibaldi. I remember glancing at my watch. It was around 11:45 p.m. I had turned off the last lamp, stretched my sore back, and walked to the window. From there, I could see the narrow street below. No tourists, no noise, no trace of life except the occasional flicker of a street light that struggled against the mist. That's when I noticed him. He was standing there, near the corner where Via Garibaldi bends toward Campo Bandiera e Moro, tall, unmoving, the kind of stillness that made my stomach twist as if the body I was looking at wasn't quite alive. His face was angled upward, not to the street, not to the sky, but to my window, directly to me. I froze. For a moment I thought I was imagining it, the exhaustion of the day playing tricks on my mind. But no, he was there, pale skin under the streetlight, a sharp contrast against the shadows pooling behind him. And his lips looked as though he was pressing them shut with effort. Not the way a person naturally holds their mouth. It was deliberate, controlled, as though he was keeping something inside. I felt the weight of his stare. Even across the distance, I swear I felt it pressing against me, cold and heavy, like the air in the room had shifted. I closed the curtain, quickly, too quickly. And then I laughed, softly, nervously. Told myself he was just another tenant. Maybe he smoked outside at night. Maybe he liked the silence. Maybe anything but what my mind whispered in the silence that followed. But my hands were trembling. I tried to sleep, turned over, counted the cracks in the ceiling. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw him again. That face tilted upward, that stillness, that silence. When the morning finally came, I looked for him. I went down the narrow staircase, past the rusted mailboxes with names I didn't yet recognize, out onto the street. The air was crisp, the sun filtering through thin clouds, the sound of footsteps echoing across the stones. But he wasn't there. No trace. No sign that anyone had stood on that corner just hours before. I asked myself if I had dreamt it, if it had been nothing but the fatigue of moving, of carrying boxes, of trying to start again. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. Still, I tried to bury it, to fold it into the corners of my mind, and pretend it was nothing. But even as I write this now, even as I say these words aloud, I can feel the memory clawing its way back. The pale skin, the silence, the weight of his eyes. That was Monday, the 3rd of March, my first night on Via Garibaldi. And already, I couldn't sleep. It was Tuesday, the 4th of March, 2021, the second night in my new apartment on Via Garibaldi. I had woken up that morning telling myself that the figure I saw outside was nothing more than exhaustion. The stress of moving, the weight of carrying boxes, the shadows playing tricks with my eyes. I almost believed it, almost. But the silence in the building made it harder to ignore. I live on the 3rd floor. There are 4 apartments on my level. 2 of the doors looked unused, no signs of movement, no mats, no shoes, no names on the little brass plates. The one across from me was different. Apartment 3B, a black door, the paint peeling, the wood swollen from age and damp air. A door that seemed older than the others, older than the building itself. That morning on my way out, I noticed something strange, a mark, faint but visible, near the bottom of that door. Scratches, 3 of them, not the kind a key or a shoe would leave, deeper, like claws dragged against the wood. I stopped, bent down, ran my fingers lightly across the grooves. They were uneven, almost desperate, and they were fresh. No dust, no polish, just raw, exposed wood. I told myself it could have been anything. Maybe an old dog had tried to get in, maybe a cat. Venice has plenty of strays, but something in me refused to accept that answer. As I stood there staring, I realized the air in the corridor felt heavier, still, like the moment before a storm. And though I heard the city outside, the faint echo of voices, the water lapping against the stone, the corridor itself was soundless, completely silent. I walked down the stairs, forcing myself to keep my pace steady. The 2nd floor looked the same. Closed doors, no sound of televisions, no smell of cooking, no muffled arguments between families. The 1st floor too. Every door locked, every window shuttered, as if I was the only person in the entire building. That afternoon, I wandered the neighborhood, looking for signs of life. I stopped at Campo San Francesco della Vigna, a quiet square not far from home. Children ran across the stones, chasing one another. An old man smoked by the fountain. 2 women gossiped near the entrance to the church. The world outside was alive. The building on Via Garibaldi was not. When I returned that evening, the corridor smelled faintly of iron, metallic, sharp. I glanced again at the black door of 3B, and I noticed something else. The handle was different. It wasn't brass like the others, it was iron, dark, cold to the touch when I brushed my fingers against it. At that moment, I felt something, not heard, not seen, but felt, a pressure, like a weight pressing against my chest, urging me to step back, and I did. I pulled my hand away and retreated into my apartment, locking the door behind me. I checked the time. It was 10:32 p.m. The city outside was winding down, but my building was already cloaked in silence. Too much silence, and that smell of iron still lingered in the corridor. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't help but think, if the other apartments are empty, if no one lives there, then who scratched at that black door? And why? Is it always closed? It was still Tuesday, the same day I had noticed the scratches on the black door. The same day the corridor smelled faintly of iron. By evening, I tried to convince myself that I was simply overthinking, that I was tired, that my imagination had always been a little too active. I made myself leave the apartment. I told myself I needed fresh air, and maybe I did. The walls of that place were starting to press in on me. I walked along Via Garibaldi, heading toward the water. The shops were closing, their metal shutters rattling down one by one. I stopped for a quick espresso at a cafe near Campo Bandiera e Moro. The barista barely looked at me, muttering something about how quiet the evenings had been lately. I almost asked him about the building, about my neighbors, about the man I thought I saw. But something held me back, a hesitation, a quiet fear of sounding foolish, or worse, of hearing confirmation of what I already suspected. By the time I reached the edge of the canal, the air had grown colder. It was close to 11 p.m. The water was black, reflecting only fragments of the dim street lamps. I leaned against the stone railing, trying to steady myself, trying to breathe, trying to believe that everything was normal. And then he appeared. At first I thought it was just another passerby, a tall man walking slowly down the Fondamenta. But the way he moved, it wasn't right, not hurried, not casual. Every step seemed measured, deliberate, like he was aware of every stone beneath his feet. He stopped beneath one of the lamps, and I saw his face again, the same pale skin, the same pressed lips, as though he were containing something within. But this time, he smiled. It wasn't wide, it wasn't friendly. It was thin, sharp, like a knife hidden in the folds of his mouth. He looked up, and I realized with a chill that ran through me that he was staring directly at me, not just in my direction, not just a passing glance, but at me, across the canal, across the distance, across the night itself. I froze. My hands clutched the stone railing so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I wanted to look away, I wanted to walk, to run, but I couldn't. His gaze held me in place, heavy, suffocating. And then, as suddenly as he had stopped, he moved again. One step, another, slow, steady, deliberate, heading toward the bridge that would bring him across to my side. That was when instinct broke through the paralysis. I turned. I walked quickly back toward Via Garibaldi, my footsteps echoing louder than I wanted them to. I told myself not to run. Running would draw attention. Running would betray the fear gnawing at me. By the time I reached my building, it was close to midnight. I rushed up the stairs, my breathing shallow, my keys clattering as I tried to fit them into the lock. The corridor was as silent as before, the black door of 3B still shut, still watching me in its own way. Inside my apartment, I leaned against the door, heart pounding. I remember whispering to myself, almost in disbelief, "You're losing it. You're a grown woman, and you're losing it over shadows." But deep down, I knew. I knew what I had seen, and I knew that the man, my neighbor, was no ordinary man. That night, lying in bed, I thought again of the scratches on the door, and of the iron handle that felt colder than it should have. And a terrifying idea crept into my mind. What if those details weren't meaningless? What if they were warnings, signs left behind, of something not meant for me to understand? I turned onto my side, closed my eyes, but the image of his smile followed me into sleep.
The next morning, I woke up later than usual. The alarm had rung at 7, but my body refused to move. By the time I managed to pull myself from the sheets, the sun was already climbing higher, filling the room with that pale Venetian light that seems to belong more to water than to sky. I needed coffee. Real coffee, not the bitter powder I kept in the cupboard. So I dressed quickly and went down to the street, making my way to the little cafe on the corner Rosso, the one with the chipped red awning and tables that always seemed too close together. I had been there before, but never in the morning. The place smelled of warm milk, fresh bread, and the faint smoke of someone's cigarette drifting in through the open door. I ordered a cappuccino and sat near the window. I thought maybe the morning light would make me feel less foolish about what had happened the night before, less like a child inventing monsters in the dark. But even with the cup warming my hands, I couldn't shake the image of that thin smile. That was when she approached me, a woman maybe in her 50s, carrying a small tray with her own espresso. Her hair was tied back, streaked with grey, her coat too heavy for the mild weather. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded politely. "May I sit?" she asked in Italian. I nodded. Of course, she lowered herself into the chair opposite mine. For a few minutes, we drank in silence. I noticed the way she glanced, almost constantly, at the door of the cafe, as though expecting someone. Finally, she spoke. "You live nearby?" "Yes," I answered. "On Via Garibaldi, number 42. Her eyes flickered at the number, just for a second, but it was enough. A pause, a shift, a subtle tightening of her jaw. "You should be careful there," she said softly, almost as if it were an afterthought, almost as if she regretted saying it the moment the words left her lips. I frowned. "What do you mean?" She shook her head quickly, dismissing her own warning. "Ah, nothing. Old stories. People like me, we always talk too much." But she looked at me again, and there was something behind her eyes. Something like pity. Something like fear. I leaned forward. "Old stories about what?" The woman hesitated, then set her empty cup back on the tray. "You are a foreigner. Yes, yes. Then maybe you don't know." She lowered her voice, almost to a whisper. "Your building, it has a history, people say. People disappear there." Her words hit me like cold water. I forced a nervous laugh. "Disappear, you mean they move away?" She didn't laugh. She didn't smile. She simply shook her head, eyes fixed on me with unnerving seriousness. "No, not like that." Before I could ask more, the door opened. A group of men entered, loud, filling the cafe with their voices. The woman rose quickly, almost too quickly, and gathered her things. "Be careful," she said again, and then she was gone. I sat there, my cappuccino half finished, my thoughts spinning. Disappearances, warnings, and that strange reaction when I mentioned the number of my building. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling slightly. I told myself it was nothing, that maybe she was just superstitious. Venice is full of superstitions, after all. Every corner has a legend, every shadow a ghost. And yet, as I left the cafe and walked back toward my building, her words repeated in my mind over and over, like the toll of a bell. People disappear there.
That evening, I decided not to leave the apartment. It was a Tuesday. The kind of Tuesday that drags like wet fabric, heavy and endless. By the time the church bell struck 9, I had already double-checked the locks twice, pulled the curtains tight, and turned on the small lamp near the bed. I told myself I wasn't afraid, that I was just tired, that maybe the woman from the cafe had gotten into my head with her talk of disappearances. But deep down, I knew it was more than that, because ever since I moved into number 42, I hadn't felt alone, not truly. Even in silence, even in stillness, there was always something, a sense of being observed. Around midnight, I was lying in bed, my eyes fixed on the ceiling, trying to force myself to sleep. That was when I heard it, a whisper, faint, almost too faint to notice. It wasn't words at first, more like breath moving through a crack. But then the rhythm shifted. The sound pressed itself against my ears, and I realized it was coming from the hallway. I sat up slowly, every muscle tense. The whisper grew clearer, like someone murmuring behind the door. My door. I checked the clock. 12:15. The building should have been quiet by then. No footsteps, no neighbors returning home, no voices in the corridor. I told myself to stay in bed, that it was nothing. But curiosity gnawed at me, so I stood, moving carefully, barefoot on the cold floor, and approached the door. The sound was real, no mistake. Someone, or something, was whispering just beyond the wood. I pressed my ear to the surface. At first, I couldn't make out the words, but then, slowly, syllables formed. "You shouldn't be here." My stomach tightened. It wasn't the neighbor's voice. It wasn't anyone I recognized. It was low, hushed, urgent, like someone pleading. I froze, breath shallow, hand trembling on the handle. Every instinct screamed at me not to open that door. And then, as suddenly as it began, the whisper stopped. The silence was louder than the voice itself. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, ear pressed to the wood, waiting, listening, nothing. Finally, I forced myself to look through the peephole. The corridor was empty, no footsteps, no shadows, just the dim light of the hallway lamp flickering slightly, as if mocking me. I backed away slowly, locked the door again, and sat on the edge of the bed. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I told myself I was imagining things, that maybe I had dozed off and dreamed it. But the faint condensation on the crack beneath the door proved otherwise. Someone had been there, whispering, breathing, close enough to fog the wood, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't truly left. The morning after the whisper, I couldn't bring myself to leave the apartment right away. I stayed in bed longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that what I'd heard hadn't been real. But the damp mark near the bottom of the door was still there, faint, but visible enough to mock me. It was Wednesday now, a gray Wednesday. Clouds stretched heavy over the lagoon, muting the light, dulling the city. Venice has a way of looking timeless, even eternal. But on days like this, it feels like a city half asleep, as if the stones themselves are tired of holding secrets. I finally gathered the courage to go outside around 10. The air smelled faintly of salt and mildew, that familiar Venetian dampness that never leaves the walls. I stepped into the courtyard behind the building, hoping fresh air might settle my nerves. The courtyard was quiet, too quiet. A square of cracked pavement, moss crawling between the stones, surrounded by walls that seemed to lean inward as though conspiring. A single tree grew there, twisted, gnarled with branches like reaching arms. I had passed it before without much thought. But that morning I couldn't stop staring at it, because beneath its branches stood a man, tall, unmoving. His coat darker than the shadows, his face tilted slightly upward, as if scenting the air. My heart stuttered. I didn't need to see him clearly to know. It was the same figure from my first night here, the same neighbor, the one who always seemed to appear when the light was weakest. For a moment I thought he hadn't noticed me, but then his head turned, slowly, too slowly, and our eyes met. Something about that gaze felt wrong, not hostile, not welcoming, just heavy, as if he was studying me not as a person but as prey. I froze. My mind raced with excuses. Maybe he was just another tenant. Maybe he was eccentric. Maybe he had lived here all his life and simply didn't know how to behave around strangers. But then, as I stood there fumbling for explanations, I noticed something. The way his lips moved, barely. A whisper I couldn't hear, mouth forming shapes too subtle to follow, as though repeating words silently. Words not meant for me, but for himself, or for something else entirely. And then he smiled, not a friendly smile, not a nervous one, but thin, precise, as if rehearsed 1,000 times in a mirror. The same smile I had seen from my window that very first night. I turned away, pretending to fix my bag, pretending I hadn't noticed. When I looked back, the courtyard was empty. No footsteps, no sound, nothing but the gnarled tree and the damp Venetian air pressing close. I stayed there for a moment longer, heart pounding, every sense alert. And then I hurried back upstairs, locked the door, and sat in silence. I told myself again that I was imagining things, that fear was making me see patterns where none existed. But deep down, I knew the truth. He had been there, watching, waiting, and for reasons I could not yet name, I felt certain that his presence in that courtyard was not by chance. I barely slept that night. Every time my eyes closed, I saw him again, standing in the courtyard beneath the twisted tree, lips moving in that silent ritual, eyes fixed on me like I was already claimed. When I finally drifted into restless sleep, it was morning already. Thursday. The light that filtered through the curtains was weak, almost colorless, the kind of light that makes the city look faded, as though time itself is wearing thin. I tried to shake off the unease, made coffee, opened my notebook to jot down some thoughts, as I sometimes did. But when I walked toward the door to grab the mail, I saw it. A piece of paper, folded once, slipped under the door. At first, I thought it was a flyer, one of those useless advertisements that appear everywhere in Venice. But when I picked it up, I felt the difference. The paper was heavy, not new. The fold sharp, precise, as if done with great care. I hesitated before opening it. My hands shook just slightly, as though they already knew what I would find. Inside, written in thin, elegant handwriting, were just 5 words. Do not trust the walls. That was it. No name, no explanation, no signature. I stood there, staring at the page, the silence of the apartment pressing in on me. Do not trust the walls. The words repeated in my mind like a riddle, like a curse. I looked around. The walls of number 42 were old, plaster uneven, cracks running like veins from corner to corner. I had never thought of them as anything but walls. But now, every shadow looked darker. Every line seemed to move if I stared too long. I folded the note again and placed it on the table, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. Who had written it? The neighbor, the woman from the cafe, someone else who knew what was happening in this building? I walked to the door, opened it, and checked the hallway. Empty. Just the same flickering light above, the same cracked tiles beneath my feet. No trace of footsteps, no sign that anyone had been there. When I closed the door again, I pressed my hand against the wood, listening, for whispers, for breath, for anything, but there was nothing. Only silence, still. I couldn't shake the feeling that the message wasn't just a warning, it was a command, a desperate plea from someone who knew exactly what lived within these walls. And for the first time, I wondered, was I still alone in this apartment? Or had something else already found its way inside? That night, sleep refused to come. I turned from side to side, sheets twisting around me, the faint light from the street lamp bleeding through the curtains. Every creak of the building seemed louder, every draft colder. I tried to tell myself it was just nerves, the note, the neighbor, the whispers, all of it feeding into my imagination. But imagination alone cannot shake a bed frame, because that was what I heard. A vibration, a sudden sharp jolt that made the metal under me tremble. I sat up instantly, heart pounding, hands gripping the mattress. The sound came again, this time from the wall to my left. A heavy thud, followed by a scraping noise, like nails dragged slowly across plaster. I froze, staring at the wall. The same wall that faced the neighbor's apartment. The same wall I had touched earlier after reading the warning, "Do not trust the walls." Another sound, not scraping, not thudding, something else, like a breath, long, steady, exhaling from inside the wall itself. My skin crawled. I grabbed the lamp from the table and pressed it closer to the surface. The plaster looked the same, cracked, uneven, nothing unusual. But when I leaned in, my ear against the cold, rough paint, I heard it clearly, a whisper. This time, louder than before, distinct, words that chilled my blood. "I see you." I stumbled back, nearly dropping the lamp. The whisper continued, faint but steady, as if the wall itself had learned to speak. Panic surged. I grabbed my coat, determined to leave, to spend the night anywhere else, a cafe, a bench by the water, anywhere but here. But as I reached for the handle, another noise stopped me. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, climbing the stairs just outside my door. I held my breath, pressed myself against the wall opposite the entrance, heart hammering so loud I thought it would give me away. The steps reached my floor, paused, silence. Then, a hand brushed against the door. I heard the faint scrape of skin on wood, followed by a low chuckle. Too soft, too close. I wanted to scream, I wanted to run, but my body refused to move. The footsteps continued down the corridor, fading until only silence remained once more. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed. Minutes, hours. Time didn't matter. When I finally forced myself back into bed, I kept the lamp on, clutching it like a weapon, eyes fixed on the trembling shadows of the room. Sleep never came. And somewhere, beyond the thin plaster and the flickering light, I knew someone, or something, was still listening. By the next evening, I had made up my mind. I couldn't go on like this, sleeping in fear, waiting for whispers through the wall, pretending the note slipped under my door didn't exist. At some point, fear becomes unbearable, and action is the only escape. So I decided I would face it, or at least see him up close, my neighbor, the man who never spoke, who always appeared where the shadows were thickest. I waited until the building was quiet, until the sounds of Venice outside dulled into a distant murmur of water against stone. Then I stepped into the hallway. The corridor smelled faintly of damp wood and dust. The flickering bulb above gave off its usual weak light, casting long, uneven shadows on the peeling walls. I stood in front of his door, number 44. The wood was dark, heavy, the kind that seemed older than the building itself. I had passed by it many times before, but never with this much attention. Now, up close, I noticed things I hadn't before. Scratches near the frame, long, shallow marks, like something had dragged along the surface over and over. And at the base, the faint glimmer of metal, a lock more complex than the ones on the other apartments, as though reinforced against intrusion. I raised my hand to knock, hesitated. My fist hovered in the air, trembling. Finally, I let it fall. 3 soft knocks. Silence. I waited, every nerve alive, straining to hear movement from inside. Nothing. No steps, no voice. Only the hollow echo of my own heartbeat. I knocked again, louder this time. Still silence. But then, a sound, soft, almost imperceptible. Not footsteps, not speech, breathing, slow, measured, just on the other side of the door. I froze, my mouth dry, my skin crawling. I knew he was there, listening, just as I had done nights before with my ear pressed to my own door. Hello? My voice was weak, shaking. I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm your neighbor. No answer, only the breath, a little deeper now, almost deliberate. I forced myself to keep speaking as though words could protect me. I'm new here. I live in number 42. If you ever need anything. The breath stopped, completely. The silence that followed was worse than any response could have been. And then, a sudden creak. The faintest shift of the lock, as if someone inside was testing it, deciding whether or not to turn it. I stumbled back, panic surging, every instinct screaming to run. But before I could move further, a voice slipped through the cracks, low, raspy, so close I felt it vibrate in my chest. You should not have knocked, I gasped, backing away, nearly tripping over the uneven tiles of the hallway. The bulb above flickered, dimmed, then steadied again. When I looked back at the door, everything was silent once more. No movement, no breathing, just wood. Cold, impenetrable wood. I rushed back to my apartment, slammed the door shut, and locked it twice. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. It was no longer just imagination, no longer coincidence. He had spoken, and his words carried more than warning. They carried a promise. The next day, I tried to live normally. I told myself I would go out, have coffee, maybe even sit by the water like I used to when I first arrived in Venice. But even as I put on my coat and shoes, I couldn't shake the memory of his voice behind that door. You should not have knocked. The words replayed in my mind like an echo that refused to fade. By the time I opened my own door to leave, my hands were trembling again. And that was when I saw it, something lying neatly on the floor of the hallway, directly in front of my door. A small envelope, dark red, sealed with wax pressed into the shape of a circle. The seal wasn't clean, it was jagged, as though whatever had been used to stamp it wasn't made for such a purpose. Still, the intent was clear. It was meant for me. I picked it up, heart pounding. The paper felt old, almost brittle, edges slightly frayed. I stood there in the hallway for a long moment, staring at it, half expecting the door to number 44 to open behind me. But it didn't. The corridor was silent, empty. Back inside my apartment, I sat at the table and broke the seal. Inside, a single piece of parchment folded twice. The handwriting was elegant, almost beautiful, but the words made my chest tighten. Tonight, midnight, courtyard. That was all. No greeting, no explanation, no signature. I stared at the paper until the letters blurred. Why me? Why now? Was this a threat or an invitation? Part of me wanted to burn it, to tear it into pieces and throw it into the canal. Another part whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was my only chance to understand what was happening in this building, to finally see the truth behind those whispers and warnings. But the fear was overwhelming. What if going meant never coming back? What if the courtyard at midnight was the last place I would ever stand? I tried to distract myself, walked in circles around the apartment, made tea I didn't drink, opened books I couldn't read, but no matter what I did, my eyes always returned to that note. Its presence seemed to fill the room heavier than the walls themselves. As the day faded and the sky darkened over the canals, I knew I was running out of choices. If I ignored the invitation, he would know. He always seemed to know. And somehow, the thought of disobeying him felt even more dangerous than showing up. So I told myself I would go, not out of trust, not out of courage, but because fear leaves no alternatives. When the bells of San Pietro di Castello struck 11, I was already dressed, shoes on, coat buttoned, the note folded tightly in my pocket. I sat by the window, staring down at the courtyard below, the twisted tree stretching its branches like black arms toward the sky, waiting, counting each slow minute until midnight arrived. And as the final bell began to toll, I whispered to myself the only question that mattered. Was I walking into a meeting? Or a trap? The bells of San Pietro di Castello had barely finished their last toll when I rose from the chair. My body felt heavy, as though every step toward the door cost me more than I could afford. Still, I walked out. I walked down the narrow corridor, past the peeling paint and dim bulbs, until I reached the staircase that spiraled toward the courtyard. The air grew colder as I descended. My footsteps echoed against the walls, though I tried to move quietly. The sound still followed me like a shadow I couldn't escape. And then, at the bottom, I saw it. The courtyard. It was smaller than I had imagined, enclosed on all sides by tall, leaning walls. The only open space was at the very top, where the night sky pressed down, moonlight spilling through like liquid silver. In the center stood the twisted tree I had watched so many times from my window, its bark rough, its branches clawing upward as if begging to escape. The silence was so deep it felt alive. Not a single cat, not a single bird, only me. I stepped closer. The ground was uneven, cobblestones cracked and damp from the mist that crept in from the canals. I reached the base of the tree and placed my hand against the bark. It was cold, colder than stone, colder than flesh. And then I felt it, a vibration beneath my palm, a faint, irregular pulse like a heartbeat buried deep within the trunk. I stumbled back, breathing hard. That was when I noticed the smell. Not of damp earth or leaves, but of iron, of rust, of blood. Before I could turn, before I could even think, a sound broke the silence. Footsteps. From the shadows at the far end of the courtyard, under the broken arch that led toward the canal, someone was walking toward me. Not quickly, not slowly. Each step measured, deliberate. The figure was tall, shoulders hunched slightly, as if the very act of walking among mortals was an effort. The moonlight caught his face for an instant and my heart stopped. It was him, the neighbor from number 44. His eyes were not like eyes at all. They seemed to absorb the light, pools of black where no reflection lived. And when he smiled, if that distorted curve of his mouth could be called a smile, I felt the blood drain from my body. "You came," he said softly, his voice carrying through the air without needing to rise above a whisper. It was the same voice that had warned me not to knock, but now it was different. Now it was welcoming, almost pleased. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but my legs refused to obey. It was as if the courtyard itself held me in place. He moved closer, each step slow, inevitable. When he reached the tree, he placed his own hand upon the bark, just as I had, and the pulse grew stronger. The sound filled my head, a heartbeat that wasn't mine, wasn't his, yet belonged to both of us in that moment. "You feel it, don't you?" he whispered, his eyes locked on mine. "The roots go deeper than you know, deeper than the city, deeper than the water. They drink what others cannot imagine." I tried to answer, but my mouth was dry. The words stuck in my throat, leaving only a shallow breath. He stepped closer, so close I could see the faint tremor of his jaw, the unnatural stillness of his chest as he did not breathe. The smell of rust, of blood, grew stronger. Then, with a suddenness that made my heart nearly stop, he reached into his coat and pulled something out. A small, rusted key. He held it out to me, palm open. "For you," he said, "because you've been chosen." I stared at it, frozen, every instinct screaming not to take it, and yet my hand lifted almost against my will. The moment my fingers brushed the cold metal, a sound erupted from beneath the courtyard, a deep, resonant thud, like a massive door slamming shut far underground. The cobblestones trembled beneath my feet. The tree's branches shivered, though no wind touched them. And for the first time, I realized this was not an invitation. It was a binding. The key was still in my hand, cold, heavy, as though it had been waiting only for me. I wanted to throw it away, drop it there on the cracked stones, and run back up the staircase to my small apartment. But my fingers clenched tight around it, and I realized, with a sudden fear that froze me in place, that I could not let it go. It was mine now. The neighbor's eyes never left me. There was no warmth in them, only expectation and hunger. He tilted his head toward the far side of the courtyard, where the stones curved inward against the wall. There, half hidden behind weeds and broken plaster, I saw what I had never noticed from my window, a small iron door, the edges eaten with rust, no handle, only a narrow keyhole. My breath caught, because I knew, before I even tried, that the key in my hand belonged to it. "Go on," he whispered. His voice was low, but it filled the air as if the walls themselves carried it. "You have already been chosen. The door will answer only to you." I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but instead I walked, step by step, toward the door. Every sound of my shoes against the stones felt louder than thunder in that silence. When I reached it, I raised the key. My hands trembled so violently I thought it would fall, but the metal slid into the lock as though the two had been forged for one another. And the moment I turned it, the ground beneath me pulsed. Not once, not twice. A steady rhythm, a heartbeat that came from the earth itself. The door creaked open, and from the blackness behind it rose a smell so sharp, so foul, it made my stomach twist. Damp stone, rot, and blood. Always blood. I turned back for only a moment, to look at him. At the man from number 44. But he was no longer standing where he had been. He was closer, so close that I could see his lips moving, though no sound reached me. And in that moment, I understood that stepping through the doorway would mean surrendering myself to whatever lay beneath the courtyard. Yet, I stepped forward. The darkness swallowed me whole. The air was cold and wet, pressing against my skin like 1,000 invisible hands. My footsteps echoed against narrow stone walls as I descended a staircase that twisted deeper and deeper into the earth. The heartbeat grew louder, so loud I thought my own ribs might crack under its weight. At some point, I cannot tell when, I heard voices, whispers, low, broken syllables in a language I could not understand. But they knew me. I felt it. They were calling my name. I should have turned back, I should have run, but my body no longer belonged to me. Each step was commanded by something older, stronger, waiting below, and then silence. I reached the bottom. The corridor opened into a chamber. I cannot describe it fully. The walls were carved stone, but alive, pulsing with the same rhythm as the courtyard tree. And in the center stood a shape, tall and skeletal, wrapped in shadows that shifted like smoke. It did not move, it only waited. The key slipped from my fingers and fell to the ground. The sound rang louder than a scream. And then everything ended. Or perhaps it only began, because I remember nothing after that moment, only darkness. If you are hearing this now, it means somehow my words survived, though I do not know if I did. Maybe I never came back up from beneath the courtyard. Maybe I am still there, wandering in that dark chamber, listening to the heartbeat that will not stop. I cannot tell you what became of me. I cannot tell you if I am alive or something less than alive. All I know is this. If you ever find yourself walking through Castello, past the narrow courtyards and leaning walls, do not stop when you reach number 44. Do not look at the man who lives there. And above all, do not take the key, because once you do, there is no coming back.